publicó por primera vez en el 2012. Ya este libro tuvo mucho éxito y una gran acogida por parte de los lectores y de la prensa en todos los países donde fue publicado. Tenemos elogios del Huffington Post, del New York Times, de muchos medios, pero no fue hasta este año, durante el confinamiento, cuando se emitió la serie, que el libro y la historia de Deborah Feldman se convirtió en un fenómeno mundial. Deborah ha escrito otro libro, Exodus, que cuenta la historia que sigue después, es decir, allí donde termina UnOrthodox, y que publicaremos en Lumen en febrero del año próximo. Bueno, Lumen cumple este año 60 años, así que me parece que esta publicación es también una manera de seguir festejando la historia de este sello que fue pionero en dar relevancia a la literatura escrita por mujeres. Empiezo entonces por darle la enhorabuena a Débora, como ya lo hice por escrito, por este gran libro, y me gustaría destacar que en nuestro dossier de prensa hemos hecho un punteo de las diferencias entre la serie y el libro, tema por el que seguramente le preguntarán mucho, Débora, pero yo quería destacar una diferencia esencial, que es la que hace la diferencia entre la literatura y todas las posibles adaptaciones audiovisuales, y es esa cualidad que García Márquez decía que tenía la literatura por sobre todas las artes, y es la ambigüedad. Es aquí donde brilla el libro UnOrthodox, en ese retrato en donde se ven todos los matices de una evolución psicológica. Así que enhorabuena, Débora, por este gran libro, que continúa y profundiza la serie en todos los sentidos. Y mi primera pregunta es la siguiente: ¿por qué decidió escribir UnOrthodox y si esperaba que su historia tuviera la recepción que tuvo?
When I was approaching adolescence, I guess my primary emotional anchor at the time was reading. And I think I had a fantasy then of being a writer, the kind of fantasy that young girls might have about being a princess in a castle with a stable full of white horses, like a ridiculous dream, like an impossible dream, that you play like a movie in your head at night so that you can fall asleep. I kind of grew out of the fantasy. I think around the time I turned 14, I certainly didn't write anything or think about writing between the age of 14 and the age of 20. And then I went to college, and I was doing that in secret for 2 years. And in college, I learned a new approach to reading. I think in the way that I read as a child, reading was an escape, and it was like access to very far off worlds. And when I was an adult in college, I read a lot more serious literature, and I read a lot of nonfiction and personal essays. And I think I learned in college how to read like an adult, which is to understand that in reading and writing, we are dealing with nothing less than life and death. It's not an escape. It's not a fantasy. It's not a hobby. You are in a workshop where life itself is on the bench. And I was reading a lot of memoirs of women at the time, women who had written their way out of powerlessness. And I had this idea at the time that if I was ever going to be a writer, the first thing I needed to do was write my own way out of powerlessness. And at the same time, I was presented with a very concrete path, because I was attending college in secret. I had this plan to leave the community with my son, who was a baby at the time, a plan that I concocted in the hospital right after he was born. I said, I'm going to leave, and I had a plan, and it involved getting an education and making friends and finding a lawyer and finding an apartment and saving money. It was a strategy, and it was very well thought through. And I was visiting lawyers at the time, right around the second year I was in college, lawyers that professors and friends at the university had introduced me to. Powerful lawyers. The first woman I spoke to was a dean of a very famous law school. She herself was Jewish. And I went to her and I said, listen, I'm 20, 22 years old. I might have still been 21 at the time. And I am from the Satmar Hasidic community, and I have a baby, and I want to leave with my baby. What advice can you give me? And she said, none. Your chances are zero. Stay where you are. Wait till your kids are grown up. Make the best of it. And then you can leave when it's just about you. It was a terrible conversation that devastated me because here was a woman who should have understood me, who was Jewish like me, but maybe that's why she knew enough about where I came from to tell me it's not going to happen. You don't have a shot. And I would never take your case because it's hopeless. But I didn't give up. I kept going to different lawyers, and I ended up at a lawyer in a big fancy law firm in Madison Avenue in New York, a lawyer who mostly represented big money cases for the upper crust of the Upper East Side, you know, people who were divorcing and fighting over things like alimony and child support. And the thing is, she was also the president of a women's lawyer association, and she had been involved as one of the pro bono lawyers in a very famous case in the 1980s of a woman from an ultra-Orthodox community who lost her children to a father that was proven to be abusive towards them. Horrible case. She was personally connected to it. So I asked her, I was like, can you give me any advice, seeing as you've actually been through it? And she said, I can give you lots of advice. It's not worth shit, and you can't even pay me for it, so why bother? The only real piece of advice I can give you is as a mother. And she said, the only thing that will really work is not a legal strategy. She said, the only thing that will work is sustained publicity. And I said, well, what about Gitti Greenwald? Gitti Greenwald was a young woman who very famously in July of 2008 made it into New York Magazine with 8 pages about how her daughter had been kidnapped from her on the playground, and she just wanted to do anything to get her daughter back. And I said, look, she was in New York Magazine with 8 pages and like a bunch of photos, and everybody was talking about it. Is that what you need? Is that what I need? And she says, no, because people talked about that for a week, and then it was over, and she lost her daughter anyway. She says, you need to find a way to get people talking about you for months, if not years. And so I realized I didn't have the luxury of waiting, you know, to become a writer, I guess. I thought the only way I can do what she's telling me to do is writing the book now. So I started writing the book before I left in college, and I finished it a few months after I left. So the book is written under a tremendous amount of pressure. It's written under the pressure of knowing that this is the only thing that is going to get you your freedom and secure your survival and the survival of your child. It's written under the pressure of time. I had to finish it very quickly. And it's written under this pressure of not really having time for reflection and time to become a writer. So it was intense. And I remember that early on I made the crucial decision to write unorthodox in the present tense, because it felt like the only way to be true to the circumstances in which I was writing the book, which is I don't have time to look back, not yet. I'll be able to do that later. And so what happened is we have a book that I think on the one hand speaks to the immediacy of the story it's telling, the fact that it's raw, that it hasn't been digested, that it's real, that the pain that I was describing was pain I was still feeling when I was writing it. Probably a gift, right? Because I think the further away we get from pain, the more we want to distance ourselves from it or cover it up. So a gift to the writing, maybe, that it was able to be so raw. But of course, also the disadvantage that comes with rawness, which is unusual, I think, for memoirs, because we are accustomed to reading memoirs that are written in retrospect, right? Memoirs that are written with the wisdom of years in between the circumstances or the occurrences and the perspective. And I think for many, unorthodox was jarring. It was startling because it is not that kind of memoir.
Yo quería hacer otra pregunta. ¿Cuál cree que es la relación entre su libro, su experiencia y el movimiento feminista? Usted ha contado que su exmarido, él también ha abandonado la comunidad Satmar. Y me gustaría preguntarle cuál cree que sería la diferencia esencial entre su experiencia, si él escribiera su versión de su vida, por llamarlo de algún modo, y la suya.
Probably the first and obvious difference relates to what I have just told you, which is that he never needed to write a book. He had the freedom to go off and live his life. Nobody stood in his way, nobody to try to take anything away from him, and he didn't need to sell his life story to get the attention necessary for survival. On the other hand, I don't blame my ex-husband for anything. I mean, even when we were fighting over custody and it got very ugly, I was never actually fighting with him. I was fighting with his family and with my community that had taken on the responsibility of fighting for the soul and therefore the life of my child. And, you know, the day that UnOrthodox was published in the US, it was February 14, 2012, and I had an appointment to go on live television with Barbara Walters for an American TV show called The View, which had over 12 million viewers at the time. And my lawyer had communicated this to the other side and had said that if the papers that we had been arguing about for the last 3 years were not signed prior to this interview, that I would go on TV and I would tell all of America that this community was trying to take my child away from me. And 10 minutes prior to the beginning of the interview, I had my papers, I had custody, I had my freedom. The book was the tool that I used to get it. Without the book, I would never have gotten it. I would be like all these other women who've lost their children. Many of them have committed suicide. The ones that haven't struggle with immense trauma and depression. And I could have easily become one of those women. And when I look at the group of people who've left this community, and today it's an enormous group, by the way, it's 10% of the ultra-Orthodox worldwide. It's thousands and thousands of people that you can no longer count. But when I left, it was 40, maybe 50. I knew them all by name. And when I look at that group then and I look at the group today, it's mostly men. It's mostly men because men have an easier time leaving. Men face less consequences when they leave. Men can also come back after they leave. And men tend to leave because they have a crisis of faith. It's an intellectual process for them. They're struggling with belief. Women don't leave because they ask themselves questions about God. They might ask themselves those questions most likely later, but women leave because they feel their safety and well-being is threatened, and above all, the safety and well-being of their children. And it's also simply much more difficult and therefore serves as a discouraging model. I mean, I thought of all the women who left before me who had failed. I had no one to encourage me. I had no role models. No one had managed it. Why would I think that I could? And till today, I'm the only one. So what can I say to women who are stuck in this community who want to get out? Can I guarantee them that it's now possible to do it the way I did? I'm a one-off. I had the book. Not every person who leaves can write the book. But the difference is that men don't need to write the book. They can get out if they want to. Surely they have consequences. Surely they have losses. But I look at the life of my ex-husband today, and he's happily remarried to a secular woman, living a secular life, working a job in a secular company, with his children having secular names. And it was so simple for him. He just had to make that decision. Maybe the decision was hard to make, and it cost him a lot in his heart. But that was all that was in the way. And I'm happy about this because surely he suffered when I turned our lives upside down. And I don't think it helped me to feel good about my own path, knowing that someone else was suffering as a result. But knowing that he's happy today helps me to understand that he's only living this life because I undertook the initiative first. And only because I did this did he decide then 4 years later to go on his own journey. And I think that that is something that is very well depicted in the series, which is something that they it hints at the end where you see that discussion between Esti and Yankee. And Yankee cuts off his curls, which essentially prevents him from returning and prevents him from achieving the same acceptance as earlier, which is something that my ex-husband did as well at a later point. And that scene is trying to show you that something has happened with Yankee that Esti has caused. And it's not about them getting together, but it's about Yankee finally going on his own journey and, you know, asking himself who he is and what he wants and can he think for himself. And sometimes women are the ones who need to do that for men.
Muy bien. Yo tengo muchísimas preguntas, pero voy a dar paso a ustedes. Entonces, Blanca comienza a dar paso.
Sí, creo que por facilitarnos a todos la dinámica y para que sea más sencilla, yo voy recibiendo las preguntas y os las voy a hacer de parte de los periodistas. Como ya os he contado que hay medios internacionales, vamos a ir poquito a poco por país para que casi todo el mundo pueda tener su oportunidad. La primera es de parte del Huffington Post, aquí en España. La periodista es Marina Velasco. Y su pregunta es que cuando en 2012, cuando se publicó el libro y ya se enfrentó a las críticas de su antigua comunidad e incluso de judíos moderados, que cómo ha llevado la autora revivir estos mismos fantasmas o estas mismas posibles críticas con el estreno de la serie en Netflix, y sobre todo también que hasta qué punto le afectan o le han afectado esas críticas y sobre todo de qué la acusan.
Oh, actually, the criticism today is very, very different from the criticism then for so many reasons. The first is the very strong distinction between what a book is and what a TV show is. The book being strictly nonfiction, the series being a kind of mix, a kind of fictional story inspired by a real story made by many people working together, whereas a book is written by one person, therefore allows one person to become the target of all the anger and all the frustration, right? It's very different. So of course, when I wrote my book, when I published my book, there were various aspects that were considered very, very controversial. The first aspect was I was a woman. In general, in the past, literature of people leaving Orthodoxy, and I'm gonna go back to the 17th century even, has been written by men. Men have always been the one to tell the story of leaving Orthodoxy. It is a story of rejecting God and rejecting faith and seeking enlightenment. It has never been a female story. Novels have been written by women about this topic. I think one is very known in the Spanish-speaking world. The older sister of Esther Kreitman wrote the older sister of Isaac Bashevis Singer, named Esther Kreitman Singer, wrote 2 novels and a section of short stories. Her first novel is based very much on her own autobiographical experience, and it deals also with the crises of coming of age as a young woman in Orthodox community and struggling with the restrictions and with the ideology. But these books are mostly forgotten. They have not achieved the recognition that the male narrative has achieved. And in my era as well, there were some women who had written novels not to great attention or acclaim, so not very well known. Most well known are books written by men, both in the present and in the distant past. So being a woman, writing a non-fiction narrative about leaving Orthodoxy is already very offensive, very new, very much full of chutzpah, right? Chutzpah is a great Jewish word for daring, for boldness. And there was one more problem, which is not only it's a woman writing, but it's writing very intimately about the feminine experience, which is huge taboo. The idea that a woman is in her body and that her body belongs to her and that she decides what her body experiences and what it feels like. This is like sacrilege where I come from. A woman's body is public property, and it's given by God for one purpose only. And the woman does not decide what her body thinks and feels about this. And a woman does not decide to take back ownership of the body and to determine, what the female body is for herself and for public. And so in my memoir, one of the things I wrote about, which has never been written about or discussed in public, are the laws of ritual purity, which is, by the way, a set of laws that apply to Orthodoxy worldwide. They are sometimes interpreted differently, by which I mean that in some communities that are more lenient or more tolerant, women are given a little bit more freedom or autonomy in how they apply those laws themselves. So they might be exposed to less supervision in the process, but the laws apply in all Orthodox communities. And it is a secret. It is a protected, taboo secret that has never been discussed openly, ever. And when I did this, and not only did I write about it, but I discussed it on national television, I crossed the line for my community. I became like the devil. I became somebody who is in the same category as Hitler, or Goebbels, more accurately, because they felt that what I was doing was akin to what Goebbels was doing, spreading anti-Semitic propaganda. Of course, I was expecting this. I think that the only surprise was more related to the success of the book. Nobody was expecting the book to be a success. The publisher said, this topic is very niche. Maybe it'll do well in New York where people know about this community, but people are not going to really respond to it anywhere else. So I wasn't prepared for criticism because I wasn't prepared for success. The success was enormous and unusual and difficult to explain or process because it was very sudden and it was emotional and intense. And of course, the community had never dealt with something like this before. So they responded with outrage, and they were not careful about this outrage. So they would go to the newspapers every day and try to discredit me and say, well, it can't be that her story has value because her mother is crazy or her father is crazy or she's just angry and so on and so forth. Nobody actually took apart the story itself. Nobody said it's a lie that women are considered impure when they menstruate, or it's a lie that women have to go to the ritual bath to become pure for their husbands, or it's a lie that when women have stains in their underwear, they have to bring it to the rabbi to inspect. Nobody says this. They don't say that's a lie. They say she's crazy, so you can't believe anything she says. I think what happened was, because the outrage was so enormous, that journalists found themselves getting threats from Hasidic people if they would write about me, and people were paid money to post negative reviews on Amazon and Goodreads and all these book reviewing websites. People started paying attention and say, wait a second, why are they so angry? I really need to read that book. And I think at some point, a few months later, they realized that all that anger and criticism had actually helped the book become so hugely successful, had fed its success. And I think that they learned from this, and they learned from various other episodes that occurred after, because after I wrote the book, many people left the community. It became like a movement, like an avalanche, and many people started to talk about it. They started to go to the newspapers and write blogs and write books and become activists. And all of a sudden, it was a topic. It was a phenomenon. Everybody knows about this now, at least in New York. And the community realizes that the old tactics aren't working for them. And so they've developed new ones. And one of the ways they've chosen to respond to the series as a result of learning from their experience is actually to not really criticize publicly at all. The Hasidic community itself has been largely silent. We get private messages from people that are either nice, that they're thankful, or that they are threatening. But they are private messages. And I'm far away. I live in Berlin. It's a COVID era. Travel isn't easy. I'm hard to reach. I feel much safer than I did then. And there's another new interesting aspect that I'd like to talk about in terms of criticism today, because there is significant criticism, but the criticism is more complicated and actually more interesting to me, because the criticism comes from the Jewish world at large, from secular Jews, from liberal Jews, from conservative Jews, from traditional Jews. It's a criticism of a world that has never had to deal with the truths that I represent. They have never had to be confronted with the fact that Judaism is a very large spectrum, and that also in the name of Judaism, injustices towards women and children can and do occur. Ordinarily, this is not a topic in Judaism. It's a topic in Islam. It's a topic in some maybe evangelical Christian sects, like the Mormon FLDS sect, or various small unique sects like the Mennonites, the Hutterites, and so on. But it is not a topic in Judaism, largely because Judaism has always claimed to be too vulnerable to have conversations about injustice and discrimination within its own community. The idea is because Jewish people have been for thousands of years persecuted by the societies in which they live, because they have been victims of anti-Semitism, injustice cannot be discussed and it cannot be addressed. And this has evolved into an era where the victimhood of the Jewish person has become much more minor. The Jewish person has become very empowered in a post-war Western society that values human dignity above all else, and that has given way to the social justice movement we know now. It has, very much Jewish identity has changed in the shadow of Israel and its politics. So the enduring belief that Judaism is too vulnerable to have a discussion about injustice is actually contributing to anti-Semitism, or contributing to the idea that Jewish people are not people like us, that Jewish people have to be different, they have to be better, therefore injustice cannot occur, and if it does occur, it will be denied because it doesn't fit into the image of Jews that are presented to the world, even by non-Jewish people, or that are presented to ourselves. Jews present themselves, or are under great pressure to present themselves as better, as immune to certain problems, which again takes away the humanness of Jewish people. I cannot be like other people. I am not allowed to have their flaws or their imperfections. I'm not allowed to focus on fixing, repairing, or making progress in my own community because my community is perfect. It doesn't need change. To admit that it needs change is to attack it, and it is too vulnerable to be attacked. But we are living in an era where we are beginning to understand that differences in identity and heritage are actually superficial. I think that this has been discussed and posited already prior to World War II, but we're actually living in an era for the first time where we're actually beginning to believe this, where this is something we agree on across cultural barriers, language barriers, religious barriers, and so on. We are beginning to understand that Catholics, evangelicals, Jews, Muslims, we may have different cultural heritages and we may have different worldviews, but we're finally understanding that actually at the end of the day, the human experience is the human experience. It's universal. And so what I'm troubled by in terms of criticism right now is the inability or the desire of the Jewish world to try to suppress my story or to try to delegitimize it, instead of using it as an opportunity to confront all the ways in which they have been hiding from an increasing problem, a problem that is not only going to threaten the entire Jewish community, but it's going to threaten the stability of the world, because as we speak, the strength of the ultra-Orthodox is growing, not just in cities like New York and London and Antwerp, but in a country like Israel, which has such a huge impact on Western politics. And in Israel, their increasing size has led to increasing influence in the government. Their increasing influence in the government has led the government to become less of a democracy and more of a theocracy, where we see biblical laws being applied like the laws of the Constitution, and secular people become subject to these laws just like the Orthodox. And what we are looking at is a potential future where the Orthodox in Israel become the absolute majority, which then dictate the politics of Israel, which then will send shockwaves throughout the entire world. I cannot overstate the influence of that. So ultra-Orthodoxy is a problem for all of us, just like fundamentalism is a problem for all of us. And ultra-Orthodoxy is also a Jewish problem that the Jewish community needs to confront. And so in one sense, the series has presented an opportunity of starting that conversation, that inner Jewish conversation, across all sorts of borders, through the vast ethnic spectrum that Judaism represents, both Sephardi and Ashkenazi and Mizrahi and Yemenite and Ethiopian and so on. The idea that we need to come together and figure out a way to have conversations between different Jewish communities, different Jewish beliefs, and to understand that we need to start building bridges so that people who want to leave these communities have an easier time getting out, find more welcoming communities when they leave, because Jewish communities tend to not be welcoming towards people like me. They tend to be prejudiced towards people like me. If you look at it as a kind of class hierarchy, people who leave ultra-Orthodoxy are at the bottom of the ladder. That's like the equivalent to the working class, uneducated, vulgar, naive. When we leave and we try to find acceptance in other Jewish parts of the community, we're laughed at or we're condescended to. That's not helping the situation. So I'm trying to use that criticism coming from the Jewish world as a springboard to start conversations, which I feel has actually been successful. So I know that's not a greater concern to the non-Jewish world, but maybe that serves as an example of how we can do that also across ethnic and religious and cultural boundaries. I talk a lot, I'm sorry.
Muchas gracias, Débora. Tenemos dos preguntas, están compartidas, tanto por Carmen Naranjo, que es periodista de la agencia EFE en España, como Natalia Blanc, que es periodista de La Nación en Argentina, y si no me equivoco también algún periodista más nos la ha preguntado, que es una pregunta como con dos partes, porque ¿qué cree tú que en el fondo hizo que tú te pudieras revelar, que tus compañeras no lo consiguieran, que tú pudiste, y cómo crees que ha afectado o cómo te ha ayudado todas las lecturas que tú hiciste de niña y de adolescente, la importancia que para ti ha tenido la literatura en la vida para poder salir adelante?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that last sentence about the life course? Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to try to remember all the parts of the question. So the first part of the question is, what caused me to rebel? That's a complex question that, of course, UnOrthodox tries to answer. That's probably, when I sat down to write UnOrthodox as a writer, not as someone who's trying to survive or get custody of a child, but, just me in front of the computer with this enormous task of writing my life story. I'd never written anything before. Of course, the question I ask myself is, how am I going to explain to readers how I came to make this decision? And that's what the book is. The book is an attempt to try to show this, and I think it shows this on conscious and subconscious levels. But of course, an important factor, as discussed in the book, having a psychological example. My mother, she was gone. Where did she go? People go. People leave. There's an outside world where my mother is. What's she doing there? What are other people doing there, right? There's just that very early question in a child's mind that would otherwise not necessarily be in the mind of any other child in my community, because most people in this community simply have never heard of someone who's left. They just don't know that it's a thing. You can do that? Really? What's out there, So there's that. And then there's a situation of being kind of born into an outsider status, which is something I think this series also touched upon very sensitively. The simple impossibility of being in a community like this when you don't perfectly fit the strict conventions and expectations of this world. And in my case, as soon as I was born, I didn't fit those conventions. I had no say in the matter. My father was mentally handicapped. My mother was gay. She left him pretty shortly after I was born. It was a very chaotic period of my early childhood where she was coming back and forth, but I had very little contact with her. When she finally left and made her own way out in the outside world, I was there, the child of a failed marriage, which is almost unheard of in this community, and at the time was probably one of the only ones, with parents who were, damaged goods. And I was the product of that marriage and of that scandal. And I was a reminder to my family and to my community of this stain, this error. And so before I even had a chance to prove myself, I was treated already as if I was not one of them, as if I didn't belong. Not by my grandparents necessarily, but by my extended family, and of course, certainly by my peers, my friends, my neighbors, my teachers, and so on. And I think that while being an outsider in a community like this is very painful, it gives you the advantage of having the perspective of the outsider. It gives you the advantage of looking at the world you're in from someone who's on the margins. And that leads you, I think, to question and to disconnect from what others accept as natural and from what others just go along with. So there's the combination of having this example of leaving in my family history and then already being treated like an outsider that I think led me to doubt, to ask questions, and to seek out the answers in any way possible. And in my case, I saw...
De una autora.
Sorry. Is everything okay? So I sought out the answers in literature, in my case. I was very curious. I remember seeing my grandfather when I was very young, always bent over his Hebrew books. And Hebrew books were only accessible to men. His books were kept under lock and key. And so I think at that very early age, it was simply, well, those books aren't allowed, so I need to find some I can access. And when I discovered the book hidden in my grandmother's drawer, I realized, wait a second, it's possible to have a double life. It's possible to be some kind of holy woman who receives approval and respect, and in secret read forbidden books, and nobody has to know. And so it began with sneaking out to the library, and I would say early on, literature was simply an escape, and it was simply fuel, food. I was hungry. I wanted to know things. I needed something. There's so little for young women in this community, and for me in particular, there was even much less. I had no siblings. I didn't belong to a family unit, which means that, as a young woman, my job would normally have been to take care of younger siblings and to help in the household, but I didn't have to do that, so I had too much time on my hands and nothing to fill it with. And so first I just filled the time with books. I think it's only later when I realized I was going to become an adult and I might have a chance at building some kind of life in that community if I worked really hard. That was when I started looking to literature for ideas about what I didn't want and for ideas about what I did want. And, you can see in UnOrthodox, I'm reading books like Pride and Prejudice. So I'm not reading contemporary novels about young women because I can't identify with the protagonists. I'm reading books about women like me, women who are stuck in conservative patriarchal societies whose only value is decided by marriage and motherhood. But they're somehow making it work. They're somehow navigating in this world towards independence and freedom. So I thought, I'll just be like Elizabeth Bennet. I'll get married, but it will be like a love marriage, and I'll have freedom in this marriage, and it will be fine because I will fit in on the outside, but on the inside, I will have something that other people don't have. And that was what I really thought, except that Pride and Prejudice is a novel. It never happened. Elizabeth Bennet is someone Jane Austen dreamed up, someone who would not have been possible in that era in England. It's a fantasy, and it's a criticism of the society that she was in at the time. And I just didn't realize it. I thought, she's giving me the recipe, She's giving me the recipe for making this life work, except this life doesn't work. And that's what the book really tells us. It doesn't work. And I had to stop reading after I got married because just like Esty in the series, she gives up piano. Because there is this assumption that everything that's not working is because she's different. She somehow wants something else. She wants more. She's not 100% committed and dedicated to her role as a woman in this world, which is get pregnant, get pregnant, get pregnant. And so, of course, at some point when I couldn't get pregnant, I was punished by having my books taken away. The idea being you can have a little freedom, but only if you fulfill your role 100%. Then you get that little bit of freedom. Then you get that little bit of authority as the compensation, but only when you do everything exactly how you're told. And since I was the problem, everything was eventually taken away from me. And so for a while, I didn't read. And when I started reading again, this time it was very different because I was at university and I was reading with other people and I was being taught how to read, how to understand literature. And there was a very clever, very, very intelligent professor early on who must have intuited many things about me. She had a terrible reputation in college. She was considered very scary. She was never nice. She never complimented anyone. And everyone told me to be terrified of her. But she pulled me into her office one day and she gave me a book. It was a collection of personal essays. And one of them was written by a famous Jewish American feminist, Adrienne Rich. And she said, I think you need to read these, and I think you need to write your own. And it wasn't an assignment. It wasn't for class. She wasn't going to give me a grade. She just said, this is what you need to do, and I know that. And she was right. And it was, it was an era where I read a lot of nonfiction. I read a lot of memoirs by women, and I realized that it's not about the fantasy anymore, but it's about what do you do with your life? How do you make it into a narrative, or how do you force it to submit to the rules of a narrative? And if I am the protagonist in my own story, how would I write it? Right? There's going to be a big denouement. There's going to be a climax. There's going to be conflict. There's going to be change. I'm not going to stay stuck in the same place forever. What kind of story is that? Nothing's happening. So I remember looking at my life as if I was a writer, asking myself questions about my characters and about my plot. How am I going to plot my life? How am I going to really be a protagonist and not some boring supporting character off to the side while everyone else gets to have the action? And so then literature became about a kind of a set of rules for how to make your life move the way a story moves.
Ahora, sí, gracias Débora. La siguiente pregunta viene de parte de Gabriela Delgado, que es periodista del Comercio de Perú. Y sobre todo le gustaría saber si, como a raíz del éxito de la novela al comienzo, sobre todo la serie, que muchísima gente se ha empezado a interesar mucho por las costumbres y el modo de vida de la comunidad judía ultraortodoxa. Y ¿cómo llevas tú que la gente se interese tanto por algo que para ti es un mundo que quieres dejar fuera?
Está bien, Ari, están haciendo algo. ¿Qué quieres hacer, Ari? También tienen derecho a trabajar. Dejen de quejarse de pendejada. No sé, ¿qué quieren quejarse? Está arreglando algo en su casa. Cuando tuvimos que arreglar nosotros las maderas, también vinieron y lo arreglaron.
All doors are open for better or for worse, so to speak. That we want to know everything about everyone. That we want to feel that despite the differences in the way we live, that we're the same. And I don't necessarily think that's bad. I think the curiosity is beneficial. Certainly, I know that I tried very hard to illuminate why this community lives the way it lives in my book. I really tried to explain what a role trauma plays in all of these rituals and beliefs. And I think that the women I worked with to make the series, who are also both Jewish women, deeply impacted by their own identity and heritage, I think they also tried very hard to kind of make that come across, that this is not just people who believe because to hell with it, why not? These are people who believe that this is the right way to live because their traumatic experience has taught them, or they have at least interpreted this way, that if they don't live like this, God will wipe them off the face of the earth. Right? They believe that the Holocaust was a punishment for assimilating, for becoming Zionist, and they have invented this way of life as a way of dealing with the trauma of the Holocaust. And they believe that by living this way, they're going to prevent another Holocaust. It's very hard to judge or blame people in that position. I certainly cannot look at my grandparents, who suffered more than I can ever imagine, and say they're responsible or they intentionally caused me suffering, because at the end of the day, my suffering is this big next to theirs. So that you will find when you speak to people who leave this community that there is very rarely actual anger or resentment. There's a lot of pain and there's loss, but we are not resentful. We actually understand why we went through what we went through. But sometimes, when we look at it from a very superficial perspective, when we read a newspaper article, for example, and in the newspaper article, all we hear about is a sect with its strange rituals and a woman who was oppressed by those rituals, we're missing crucial information. And of course, and that's where the media plays such a vital role, is how is the media going to convey these complex stories that take a long time to tell and show to a concise summary that still manages to to cover all of the complex shades between black and white. And that's something that, at the end of the day, people who write books or make TV series don't have as much control over as they'd like, right? Because the media, press is free, and the press will make of it what they want. And yet, my experience with the media has been largely positive. There is an increasing amount today, worldwide, of young female journalists who are getting assigned to work on these stories that previously wouldn't have been assigned to them. When my book first came out, I was being interviewed by a lot of men, by a lot of white men. So, that's changed. It seems to be more diverse. It seems to be a bigger mix, which means that the way that the story first attracts attention of the public is often more nuanced, and the press plays a large role. But I'm sure that it is not yet perfect. However, I can see, based on the differences in the way the story was communicated in the international press now versus the way it was in the past, that we have come a long way in terms of how we process stories about strangeness, about alienness and exoticism. We are much less likely to distance ourselves from them and to to exoticize them, and much more likely to see commonalities, connections, context. Did I answer all the parts? I don't remember.
Sí, nada, fenomenal. Y tenemos ahora una pregunta de Paula Vallés, que es del diario La Tercera de Chile. Y es que si consideras que a través de tu historia, la historia que relatas, si has podido inspirar a otras mujeres de la comunidad ortodoxa a que no se sientan cómodas con esa realidad de la actualidad, que puedan decidir qué hacer.
I would avoid putting it in those exact words, because I'm really not alone. Like if you could have a peek into my daily life, I'm part of a really big international network of people who've left. As I mentioned earlier, it's thousands and thousands of people today, and I have a lot of friends with similar backgrounds. Some of them live in Berlin. Yes, as I mentioned, it's primarily a group of men, but there are also women I'm connected to who have left. So I'm not the only one. I seem to still be the only one who's left successfully with a child, but I'm not the only woman. And I think that if you take a look at the press around this topic in the last decade, you'll see that it really has become a movement, and many people have spoken out. And I think that it's the movement that inspires a movement, right? I don't think that I am at the heart of it. I don't think that I started it. I think I contributed to it, but I would never take the credit solely upon myself. I have met many very courageous people who have gone this journey on their own, without the help of the public, without the help of powerful, important, and connected people the way that I had it, and in a sense have been braver than I have been. And certainly I think if you put all of that together, all these stories from all over the world, you have a movement that is inspiring and that causes people to question if they are happy, to question if they are willing to risk losing, what they're still attached to and starting over. Yes, there is something happening. It's like, it's infecting. On the other hand, it's also still very difficult. It has become easier for men to leave. It has not become easier for women. The community doubles down when it comes to women. They get even stricter and more controlling, partly because the survival of the community is dependent on the submission of women. Women are needed not only to reproduce for the community, so to literally ensure its survival, but they are also needed to perform the day-to-day manual labor that keeps the engines of the community running, because the men in this community primarily spend their time involved in study, prayer, and spiritual work. community, which growth is very important to them for both spiritual and practical reasons, it also threatens the very current, in the moment survival. So it's not just the future, but it's right now. Women are depended on every single day to keep the community running. So they're much less likely to just let women go all of a sudden. And unfortunately, in the last decade, I have learned of too many cases of suicide of young women, both from my community in New York, but also from communities in Israel. One was quite recent, shortly before the series aired, a young woman who had had doubts in her teenage years in her community in Israel, and who had been given very strong psychotropic drugs that we give to people who have severe psychosis, like schizophrenics, to keep her from making waves. And she eventually went off those drugs and she escaped. But years of taking those drugs had a devastating impact on her mental and emotional health. And shortly before the series aired, she committed suicide. It was part of a wave of such suicides in Israel. It made the news both in Israel and abroad. Every time something like this happens, it's very difficult for me, because I feel somehow, and I have always felt, that my fate is connected to the fate of other women like me. And every time someone commits suicide, I am overwhelmed with this irrational fear that I will end up that way as well, that we have a common fate, that we're trapped in it. Over the years, I have had so many letters and messages from people telling me to commit suicide. Various times people have started rumors that I have committed suicide. This has a very intense psychological impact, and the community is very invested in the few women who leave committing suicide. And the reason why they are invested in this is because they need to be able to point their finger at people like us and say, see, what happens when you leave is you kill yourself. And this is the way they can convince people living inside who have doubts, that's the only other option, killing yourself. The fact that they haven't yet killed themselves is a really big problem for them, because there's one success story out there that's very public. And so they're still invested in this. They're still invested in showing me, to be the ultimate emblem of unhappiness and failure. And they try very hard to have that kind of psychological impact on me, which is why I chose to live so far away and to really kind of reinvent myself completely to get away from the psychological control of this community. But one of the early decisions we made in the Netflix series, when we were developing the character of Maisha, and Anne and Alexa, the women who were writing the screenplay, came to me and said, oh, we're thinking of this character. He should represent like an amalgam of like all the different people in this community who kind of bully you and threaten you. And they said, oh yeah, he's going to have a gun and he's going to chase her down. And I was like, no, you have it all wrong. This is not a community that will use violence against you. This is a community that will tell you to use violence against yourself. And in the end, you have this scene where Maisha takes out a gun, but he's not going to threaten her and he's not going to hurt her. He says, don't worry, you'll do it yourself. And he gives it to her. And that is the symbol, that is the metaphor for how the community deals with women who leave. Not with men, with women. They will not stop, they will not rest until we jump from the skyscraper, until we overdose on pills, until we admit that there's no life for us anywhere but in that community, in that one life we are allowed to live. Have I answered the question? I forgot the question. Sorry.
Tenemos otra, para terminar una última pregunta y luego tenemos pregunta de parte de Colombia, del periódico del diario El Espectador, el periodista Santiago Díaz Benavides, y quiere saber qué fue lo más complicado de asumir después de haber abandonado la comunidad. ¿Qué es lo que te costó más de recuperar, asumir o comenzar tu vida una vez te fuiste?
That question has to be addressed on multiple levels, because what we need to do is we need to talk about the practical level first, the very practical level of survival. When you leave this community as a young person without any education, without any connections, without any knowledge of social conventions, you have this challenge of how do you cement new relationships? How do you get a job? How do you support yourself? How do you figure out things like having your own bank account, doing your taxes, just basic survival, things you just never learn and you are not prepared for. And then imagine doing that with a child. So I would say that if we're thinking about the practical level, the most difficult thing to deal with when you leave is survival, just financial survival. How do you eat? You know, how do you keep a roof over your head? That was really difficult. So the first 3 years, I was always standing on the edge of a cliff. And I was always looking down into the abyss of homelessness and starvation and absolute catastrophe. And I did many things to survive, and it was always a hustle, and I was always living in desperate poverty and always precarious and very vulnerable. And at one point, I donated my eggs. I don't know if people understand what I'm talking about, but you know, if you have, like, as a young woman who's fertile, you can sort of sell your eggs to women who are struggling to have children. And in America, there are no laws regulating this. This is perfectly allowed as like a business transaction, and nobody will protect your health or safety in that process. But it is the better alternative to prostitution, which is what I thought at the time, because you do it once, your eggs are extracted, and you earn $10,000. So at some point when I was very desperate, I did that, with, of course, lasting physical consequences. But that's just the easy part, I would say. The actual hard part, and this is probably maybe something you only realize the extent of once the financial situation has somewhat stabilized and you're not thinking about homelessness and starvation anymore, is when you leave a community like this, you have nothing. Like, you literally have no sense of self, because everything that contributed to the sense of self is gone. Your community has always defined who you are. The self in the Satmar world is collective, not individual. So even though I was nurturing some kind of inner personality throughout my entire childhood that I kept a secret, it was not enough to then become a self once I left. And if you strip away your family and your beliefs and your culture and your language and your rituals and your social manner, if you get rid of everything, who are you? You are not even a person anymore. You're like an empty shell. And that is what causes the true crisis, also the mental health crisis that so many people go through. I think about this young woman named Faggy Mayer, who jumped from a New York City skyscraper in 2015. I remember being jealous of her when she left. She left before she got pregnant. She didn't have a kid. She got an education. She was super smart. She had all these great friends. She started her own business. It was like an internet startup. It was really getting a lot of attention, and it was so successful. And she had even managed to go out there and really build a life for herself and survive. And I was so jealous of her. And then she committed suicide. And I think it's completely underestimated that the true crisis in this situation, despite the practical difficulties, is that mental health crisis of having everything that gave you a sense of identity taken away with nothing to replace it immediately. It takes years, I would say a minimum of a decade, sometimes longer, based on what I've heard from other people like me, to fill in all the gaps. What is your new language? What are your new beliefs? Who is your new family? Where is your home? What do you want from life? What are you willing to do to get it? These are questions that take a long time to answer. And in the space between when you're in nothingness, when you are no one, it can feel like death is the only true representation of your state of being, because death is nothingness and you already feel nothingness. And for me personally, I think what ended up being the blessing, right? What ended up being the key to getting through that phase that so many people have not managed to survive is that I had a kid. I had like something external, something outside of myself to focus on, to give me orientation, to give me an identity. I'm a mother, I'm his mother, to give me tasks every day that needed to be done. And of course, also a belief system, a belief that he was different, that he deserved better, that I was going to build a life, if not for me, then for him. And so I got lucky in a sense. What I thought was my disadvantage, my burden, turned out to be my blessing. And I credit my son for surviving this period. When I look back, I actually can't imagine I would have done it otherwise. So while the question asked what was the most difficult thing to accept, I would say that I can go on and on forever with my answer because everything was difficult. But I would like to limit it to these two aspects because I think they are the most primal and that they represent also a very interesting sort of double-layered conflict of survival on a practical level and survival on a psychological level. But of course, if we had the time, I could go on.
Muchísimas gracias, Débora, por tu tiempo. Sí, se han metido en la reunión. Que muchísimas gracias por tu tiempo y por responder a las preguntas. Sé que no tenemos más tiempo para los periodistas, así que te dejo con María ya para cerrar.
Sí, yo quisiera terminar con...
Yeah, and I'll just... sorry, Blanca, I can't even see you anymore, but I remember we did this last week as well. If there are very urgent questions that have not been addressed, that occur to multiple journalists, we can follow up via email, and then in the following days, I think that should be possible for the very urgent ones. Yeah.
Thank you. So I will send you your email, and thank you so much. María.
Sí, yo quería hacer una última pregunta para terminar con una reflexión optimista que creo que es al final la esencia del libro. Cuando leía UnOrthodox recordaba dos grandes libros con los que veo puntos en común. Uno es Una educación, Educated, el libro de Tara Westover, que publicamos además en Lumen con mucho éxito y tuvo mucho éxito internacional. Y otro es Persepolis, de Marchand Satrapi, que también creo que tiene una historia con puntos en común. Y veía dos elementos en común y me gustaría por ahí terminar con una reflexión sobre eso. Uno es la relación de las protagonistas con su abuela, una relación más íntima que con la madre, lo que me lleva a pensar si quizás hay más posibilidades de conexión saltándonos una generación o no. Y lo otro es si la reflexión o la idea final es que podemos salvarnos de algún modo, liberarnos gracias a la educación, la cultura y el arte, como es en el caso de estos tres experiencias.
Isabel, I didn't hear anything after the generations. Can you repeat? Okay, first of all, obviously I'm very proud and moved to be considered in the same category as Tara Westover and her book Educated, and of course Persepolis, both books that have made huge impact worldwide. And I think that it cannot be taken for granted that a story like UnOrthodox moves into that category, because the story of a young woman leaving Jewish fundamentalist community is not expected to find the kind of resonance that someone leaving a Christian or Muslim community would find, partly because the populations of the Christian and Muslim world are bigger and they are just simply culturally more present, and also because Judaism, at least culturally speaking, seems to occupy a very unique space in the cultural sphere, a space made very small by the awareness, the constant awareness of vulnerability and of the weight of history, which limits the way we tell stories and what stories we tell, partly because for centuries we simply didn't trust our audience to be able to deal with our stories, to be able to understand our stories. And so we kept them for ourselves. And the fact that a story like this can be told and is heard, I mean, the success in the Spanish-speaking world has been unprecedented and a total shock to everyone. The fact that cultures that are very far away from the one I grew up in seem to connect and identify with the story shows us how much has changed in our world, how different our time is compared to the times before. And that makes me feel, in a way, that we have achieved a kind of collective freedom, you know, a freedom of storytelling. Storytelling doesn't have boundaries anymore. And so that might even support your last question about do we find freedom through art. I do certainly feel that we find freedom through storytelling, but I also would go back to the issue you mentioned about the relationships between women and say I still believe that we will find our freedom through relationships with each other. I think that women have never had an opportunity to really appreciate each other, to really benefit from each other. So much of our energy has always been commandeered in the name of servicing patriarchy and of taking care of men and boys. I'm in this really interesting phase in my life right now where I have been developing this tremendous appreciation for the women in my life. I find the women in my life enchanting, really smart, so funny. They make me laugh like nobody can make me laugh. So full of ideas and visions and hopes. And I think to myself, what a shame it was that I was always deprived of female company, of authentic, intimate female company, because one of the things that happens in a community like mine is that the trust between women is actively destroyed, so that they don't grow close to each other and that they don't find solidarity within each other and instead become each other's enemies. And maybe what you noticed about the grandmothers is a very rare exception that patriarchal communities cannot have an impact on. A kind of connection that somehow stands outside the influence that the community tries to have on the way women relate to each other. And that might complicate mother-daughter relationships, sister relationships, or friend relationships. But somehow there is something between the oldest generation and the youngest generation that I think might very well be more powerful than any communal impact. I mean, it's an interesting theory. I personally feel that the woman that I am today is a direct result of my relationship with my grandmother. And I still feel more influenced by women in my everyday life than I do by men. Which is not to say I don't like men, because I do like men, but it's just that when you grow up in a world that is solely focused on men, it takes a while to realize that women are also actually people and that they can be more exciting and more mysterious and more entertaining as well. Yeah, so that's my answer.
Pues fantástica culminación para esta conversación. En el libro hay una frase con la que me gustaría terminar, es una cita de UnOrthodox. La frase es: la voluntad de Dios me exasperaba. No existe otro deseo que el deseo humano. Creo que esa es la gran enseñanza de este libro. UnOrthodox está en las librerías este jueves, la edición de Lumen en español y la edición de Columna en catalán. Y en febrero del año que viene, Lumen publicará Éxodus. Les damos las gracias a todos los periodistas de España, de Cataluña y de Latinoamérica que nos han seguido. Pedimos disculpas porque no ha habido tiempo de preguntas para todos, pero creo que las declaraciones de Débora nos han llenado de emoción y de sabiduría. Así que muchas gracias a todos y nos reencontramos en sus libros. Adiós.
Yeah, I would love to say thank you as well, of course, to Lumen for publishing Unorthodox in Spanish, which is very, very exciting for me, as it's probably one of the biggest literary markets in the world. And of course, also thank you to the Spanish and Latin American communities for identifying so passionately with this book against all expectations, and giving me so much feedback, resonance, warmth, and benevolence, and just absolute, in German there is this great word Wohlwollen, which is just something that has blown me away, the general positivity that I have experienced in the Spanish-speaking world, which I am especially grateful for. So thank you for making all of this possible, and it has been a very meaningful experience for me.
Yes.
Muchísimas gracias a todos. Os mandaremos el enlace de la reunión grabada para que la podáis tener, que me imagino que aunque sea solo o por recuerdo o porque necesitáis recursos para hacer el reportaje, para tele o para radio, se está descomprimiendo, os la enviaremos ahora. Y si por un casual en las próximas 2 o 3 horas a alguien no le ha llegado, que me vuelva a enviar un email y yo se la haré llegar. Que muchas gracias a todos y que nos vemos pronto y cuidaos mucho.
Adiós.
Perfecto. Digo, y la otra es todo lo que es lo que hacemos con nuestros medios propios, que también te puede ser bastante útil ahorita en lo que ya estás desarrollando, que puede ser interesante, ¿no? Todo lo que es los medios como son Diario Judío, Tijuanotas, Cristianotas, etcétera. Ahí